First Kings chapter 14. Let's turn there together. I haven't preached to you all year. It's going to be a long one tonight. First Kings chapter 14. We're going to look at the first 20 verses in this text. You might not be a sports fan, but you might know about it whether you are or not. But Monday Night Football took place the other day, and in the early stages of that football game, a young man got hit in the chest, had a cardiac arrest, brought the ambulance out on the field, did CPR on him for 9 minutes, and it messed with both teams so bad as they watched somebody having chest compressions and at the point of death that they couldn't even continue the game. They had to call it off and just stop playing and send everybody home. But if you were to listen to the TV announcers, if you were to go on any kind of social media at all you would hear is people saying, pray, 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 pray for this person, pray for this person, pray for Damar Hamlin. You know, when disaster strikes, that's the instinct of people is, let's turn to God. Let's see if we can get God to help. Let's ask God to do a work. When you look at the text tonight, what you're going to find is that there's a king whose son is close to death. And his instinct was the same as theirs. It's been true since the beginning of time. Call upon the Lord, seek help from God, ask God to do a work. He knows that he needs help. He needs help from above. But there's a problem. But the disaster has struck the king, and so what he's going to do is, because he himself has not been faithful to God and has walked away from God, he's going to try to send his wife to a prophet. He's going to seek help from a man of God to see if his son might be spared. The prophet that she's going to go to is the same man that came to the king, anointed him, and said, you're going to be the next king of Israel. So it's somebody that he's familiar with, but the prophet is now blind. And so the title of the message is, What Did the Blind Man See? But before we talk about what the blind man saw, I want you to be familiar with what the king didn't see. So let me read the first part of the text to you. Chapter 14, verse 1, the book of 1 Kings reads this way. At that time, Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, became sick. Jeroboam said to his wife, arise now and disguise yourself, so that they will not know that you are the wife of Jeroboam. Go to Shiloh, and behold, Ahijah the prophet is there, who spoke concerning me that I would be king over this people. Take 10 loaves with you, some cakes, and a jar of honey, and go to him. He will tell you what will happen to the boy. Jeroboam's wife did so, and arose and went to Shiloh, and came to the house of Ahijah. Now Ahijah could not see, for his eyes were dim because of his age. Now the Lord had said to Ahijah, behold, the wife of Jeroboam is coming to inquire of you concerning her son, for he is sick. You shall say thus and thus to her, for it will be that when she arrives, that she will pretend to be another woman. When Ahijah heard the sound of her feet coming in the doorway, he said, come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why do you pretend to be another woman? For I am sent to you with a harsh message. Go say to Jeroboam, thus says the Lord, God of Israel, because I exalted you from among the people, made you a leader over my people Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David, and gave it to you. Yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, to do only that which was right in my sight. You also have done more evil than all who were before you, and have gone and made for yourself other gods and molten images to provoke me to anger, and have cast me behind your back. Therefore, I am bringing calamity on the house of Jeroboam. Time magazine used to back when there was a Time magazine. I don't even know if they still exist, if anybody even reads magazines anymore. They used to come out every year with their Man of the Year. They've been doing that for a long time. But what's interesting about their Man of the Year is that they describe that as the person who most affected our lives and the news for good or ill. So it didn't have to be a good person. In 1938, they chose Hitler, Person of the Year. But certainly he had a big effect on everybody. Jeroboam, the king that we're talking about in the text tonight, is probably the person of 1st and 2nd Kings. His shadow probably cast a larger shadow than anybody else in the book, even more so even than Solomon. The effects of what he does ruins 2 nations. It causes catastrophe for people for centuries to come after him. He's that kind of guy. He was chosen by God, but he turned his back on God. Helen Keller said that the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but having no vision. Tonight he's sending to a blind prophet, but that man could see. He had the right kind of spiritual vision, sight. This is a king that had no vision at all. He couldn't see the consequences of what he was doing. He couldn't see why it was wrong. He chose to go his own way and do his own thing. Disaster has struck his family, and he's chosen to try to get an answer from God and get help from God. But the sad thing about it is it all really could have been prevented. It could have gone a completely different way. It didn't have to go the way that it went. Not with him, not with his family, not with the nation, not with anything. And so, as you look at this man tonight and you see what's going on, let me show you some things that he turned his eye to, or turned a blind eye to, as it were. You know, we use phrases like that sometimes: turns a blind eye, or shut your eyes to the truth, or, you know, choose not to see or refuse to see. And what we mean by that is people are ignoring things, or they're overlooking things, that are pretending not to see or not to notice. You know, the thing is, if we turn a blind eye to God's truth, we can also face disaster, just like they faced disaster. So the truths that are before us that we see even in this text, we need to heed them, we need to understand them, and we need to apply them to our life in the right way, not the wrong way. For instance, let me share the first one with you. Even the king is under God. You know, in verse 2, Jeroboam is sending his wife, disguise yourself so they don't know you're the wife of Jeroboam. Go to Shiloh, behold, Abijah the prophet's there, who spoke concerning me that I would be king over this people. So he has been chosen by God. He has been anointed to be the king. But even the king is under God. You know, when we say our Pledge of Allegiance, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which I stand, one nation, under God. You ever think about that phrase, under God? We say it so much, I wonder if sometimes we don't think about it. We are supposed to be a nation and a people that are under God. And the nation of the United States, historically, is a Christian nation. That's what's meant by under God. It's not just any God. There's one God that the people have followed from the beginning in this nation, maybe not now, but we're supposed to submit ourselves to the God of the Bible, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the God that gave us the 10 Commandments, to the God who gave us the book, to the God that sent his son to a cross to die for our sin, and then the God that raised Jesus from the dead. We're supposed to submit ourselves to Christ himself, his laws, his rules, his way. We are supposed to be a people that are under God. Well, the king was supposed to be under God. He's supposed to be one that submits himself, not as the leader, as the one that's in ultimate authority, but he himself is under the authority of God. So that he is ruling not as one that is in complete power, but that is one that is subject to what God has said and tries to lead the people to follow God as well. But he hasn't done that. Instead, he's turned his back on God. He's walked away from God, and he's led his people to do the same thing. He is blind to the reality that he is one that is supposed to be under God's authority, that God is the leader. And if you ask who's the king of Israel, he should say, God's our king. I just serve by serving him. Number two, not just that he's blind to who's really in charge and that he's supposed to be under God, but he's blind to the fact that he can't hide anything from God. You know, he's going to disguise his wife and send her to a prophet. And it's kind of funny. Why would you put a disguise on a woman to go see a blind man? Did y'all think about that when I read that? If he's blind, I mean, he's up there in age. But the thing that this really tells you is that even though that this prophet had a time where he spoke into this man's life and was a spiritual person that could be a guide and a help and an asset, he had nothing to do with him for so long that the man had gone blind and he didn't even know it. I think that's probably what we can read between the lines and see here. So he's going to disguise his wife. Now, why is he doing that? He's doing that because when he sends her to the prophet, he wants to get a good word. He wants to hear something good. But he's been so far and so deep into sin that he's scared that if he goes himself, he's not going to get a good word, that his very presence is going to get a bad word, that there's going to be a bad reaction. And so he's going to send her instead. And he's going to put her in a place where it's going to look like she's not really the wife of a king, so that the whole thing's going to be a ruse that's going to bring about maybe a good answer. She's going to show up, hey, I'm this mama, I've got this boy, he's sick, he's dying, can you do anything for me? And the prophet says, I've spoken to God, God's going to heal your child, go back home. And the idea is that nobody's the wiser, that it's the son of the king that's rebelled against God. You can't hide from God. You can't hide anything from God. God knows everything that can be known. So, when he disguises his wife, by the way, did you notice he sent a gift with her as well? Take 10 loaves with you, some cakes and a jar of honey. You know, the truth is that that's not really the kind of gift a king should send. I know that this is part of the ruse and it's part of the, you know, I'm going to send this small little gift to a prophet. But God's done a lot for this man. God's made him a king, given him a position, a throne, kingdom. I mean, don't you think the right thing to do would be to show up and say, I've sinned against God. I'm asking God to forgive me. I want you to forgive me. I want you to know that I'm turning back to God, and I'm going to honor God with my life. And the very first thing I'm going to do is offer a gift that's in accordance with all the good God's done me. And I'm going to give this great offering. God's blessed me so much. I'm going to give this, and hopefully it'll be used to be a blessing to others. But he doesn't do that. He just sends some little paltry gift. I'm gonna send you some Krispy Kreme donuts here. Get a few little cakes with some honey, and hope that all that'll work out. He should have known that God would see this. Let me remind you of what it was like when God called him. Because when Ahijah came to him the first time, I'm just going to read to you one verse out of chapter 11, verse 33. Ahijah explained to him why he was going to get this kingdom. Remember that King Solomon had been on the throne, and his son Rehoboam had taken over when Solomon died. And the people under Solomon had turned away from God. They'd started following false gods. Solomon had built temples to these false gods there in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. And when he did that, the people turned and went astray. And Solomon did all that because he married wives that were from foreign lands, and they worshiped those gods. And so here's what was said. Because they have forsaken me and worshiped Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon, the god of the sons of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways, doing what was right in my sight, observing my statutes and my ordinances as his father David did. What God was saying is, I saw everything they did. I knew everything that was going on there. It was in my sight. It was right before my eyes. I wasn't blind to a single thing. I knew what they were doing, and that's why I'm judging them. That's why I'm taking it away, and that's why I'm giving it to you. Now, if you're the king and you hear that, at your very time when you're called, you know that God sees. You know that God knows. You know that nothing's hidden from his sight. He's aware of it all. But you know, people today still think they can hide things from God. They'll do things and say, well, it's out of sight, it's out of mind. I'm not thinking about it. If I'm not thinking about it and I don't see it, I reckon God doesn't see it and God doesn't think about it. But that's not so. You can't hide from God. There's not a thing that you've done that he doesn't know about. It's all before his eyes. And so what this king is doing by sending his wife there is he's basically doing what a lot of people do today, because they still do it. My seminary professor called it spare tire religion. The only time you want God is when you have a blowout. The only time you want God is when you have disaster. Let me go call on God now that somebody's sick and dying. Don't want anything to do with God any other time. And by the way, if the one that gets sick gets healed, you think they're going to start serving God and be faithful again? Oh, I want you to heal me so I can start going to church. I want you to heal me so I can start serving Jesus. I haven't been faithful like I should be, but I want the healing so that I can be faithful to God and take the time that God's given me to honor him. And no, they're not like that, are they? Well, that's how he is. God's just a spare tire. Pull him out the trunk whenever you have a blowout, and then don't ever think about him any other time. So the king's under God. You can't hide anything from God. Let me move a little faster here. Everything is God's. Let me jump down to verse 7. You saw where Jeroboam's wife, let me read from verse 4 down to verse 7, just to remind us what we just said. Jeroboam's wife, she went to Shiloh. She came to the house of Ahijah, and Ahijah could not see, for his eyes were dim because of his age. The Lord said to Ahijah, she's coming. Her son, he's sick. You'll say thus and thus to her. It's going to be when she arrives, she's going to pretend to be another woman. So Ahijah heard, isn't that awesome the way God spoke to his prophet? It's like the angel of the Lord just came and stood right there beside him and spoke directly to him and told him exactly what's going on. He can't see, he's blind, but he's got spiritual sight. He sees with eyes of faith. When Ahijah heard the sound of her feet coming in the doorway, he said, come on in, wife of Jeroboam. Why you pretend to be another woman? I'm sent to you with a harsh message. And here's what he said, the first thing. Go say to Jeroboam, thus says the Lord, God of Israel. Now my third point was what? All is God's. Now why do I say that with that? Why did I stop right there? I underlined in my Bible the words of Israel. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Now remember, there's been a civil war. The nation of Israel is a long, lean country. It's kind of split in half now. You got the northern area that's ruled by this guy Jeroboam. 10 tribes up there. You got the southern part, Judah. It's in the bottom. That's the family of David. They've still got that. This northern part's called Israel. The bottom part's called Judah. And God says, I'm the God of Israel. What he's trying to say is this. Those people you rule, those are my people. It's God speaking. I'm the God of Israel. In other words, the king is a steward. He's supposed to be one that manages what God has given him. But God hasn't relinquished control. He hasn't relinquished his right. He has not lost his claim over these people. These are his people that he is in covenant relationship with. These are my people is what God's saying. Everything is God's. These aren't Jeroboam's people. These are God's people. And so Jeremiah, who's supposed to be under God, whose everything is seen by God, needs to be reminded that where he serves and who he serves, those are God's people. Everything that he has, God has given him. In fact, my fourth point is this. All that God gives, he can take away. And God's about to do that. Jeroboam's going to lose everything. God's given him a kingdom. He's going to lose it. His family's not going to rule and reign. God's given him lands and homes. He's going to lose it all. But the worst part is he gave him a family. And God's taken that away too. You know, Jeroboam as a steward is supposed to manage what God gave him, just like God has made you a steward over what you have. I mean, everything that you're seeing here that's true for him is true for us. Everything you do, God sees it. Everything God gives you, you're supposed to manage it as not one that is the ultimate owner, but understanding that everything you have belongs to God. You got a swimming pool, that's God's swimming pool. You got a pickup truck, that's God's pickup truck. You got an IRA and a savings account, that's God's. It's not yours. You're the manager of it. And in the same way that God is speaking to Jeroboam to remind him that what I gave you I can take from you, same thing we need to remember. Because again, this is a disaster that's coming that could have been avoided. Had he not been blind to these truths, he could have ordered his life accordingly so that he submits himself to God and lives under God's ordinance and tries to honor God with his life and his decisions he makes. Instead, he goes his own way, does his own thing, and now God calls him on it. And again, he should have known all this. He should have known that when God made him king and gave him this kingdom, it was conditional. This wasn't an unconditional promise. It was fully conditional. I'm going to go back and read one more verse about when Jeroboam was called to be king. Verse 38 of chapter 11. It will be that if, and notice that word, if you listen to all that I command you, if you walk in my ways, if you do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I'll be with you and build you an enduring house, as I built for David. I will give Israel to you. If you do these things. But he didn't do them. Now, if God could look at the family of David, look at Solomon, the son of David, and say, I'm taking the kingdom away because you hadn't done right. If God would do it to them, don't you think he would do it to this guy too? You see, that's the thing about God. He's faithful. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And if he's ever done one thing one time, it's a promise and a guarantee that he'll do it again as soon as the same circumstances come up. When God gives him this kingdom, he doesn't give it unconditionally. It's to be held loosely because it can be lost. Everything God gives, God can take away. And I wonder how many times people in this world have lost their families, have lost their own lives, have lost their property and their possessions. How many times have people gone their own way and walked away from God and gotten themselves into a mess and then lost everything that God gave them when it could have been avoided had they surrendered and submitted to God? Marriages have been lost. Children have been lost. And I don't necessarily mean always their lives are lost. I mean the children walk away from God. And all sorts of things can come into people's lives when they don't pay attention to God. Let me give you the fifth thing here. You know that everything is God's. You know that what God gives, he can take. Verse 7, the second part of it into verse 8, I also want you to see that you need to not be blind to all that God's done for you. God begins to rehearse here where Jeroboam came from and what he brought him from and brought him to. He says, because I exalted you from among the people and made you leader over my people Israel and tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. Yet you have not been like my servant David. So he starts telling me four things here. I exalted you. I made you a leader. I took stuff away from David. And what I took from David, I gave it to you. You ever think about all that God's done for you? You ever rehearse or rehash in your mind your own testimony? You ever think about being lost on your way to hell? And God, by the Holy Spirit, convicted you and broke you of your sin and made you desire something different, and God showed you Christ lifted up on a cross for your sin. How God helped you to believe. And when you called on his name, God saved you and rescued you and came to live in your heart and washed away your sin and gave you a new life. How you could have been on the way to hell and God rescued you and now he's given you himself, which means he's giving you everything that's good and wonderful for all of eternity, that you'll be happy forever and no more sorrow, no more pain, what we've got coming is fantastic. And the best of it all is God gave us Jesus. Nothing better. And we sometimes get so caught up in our little pity parties and we get our eyes off God and on something else, and we forget all the good that God's done for us. Sometimes it's good to remember your testimony. Sometimes it's good to remember what God saved you out of, how God changed your life, what you used to be like, what you like now. You ever think about what your life would have been like without Jesus? What your children would have been like? Grandchildren? Your grandchildren's got praying mamas and praying granddaddies now. Boy, we need that in this day. What if you didn't know Jesus and they didn't have that? What a difference it would have made in their lives too. I mean, it makes such a difference when you know Jesus. And this guy, God had raised him up and exalted him, given him position, given him treasure and soldiers and land, given him everything. He didn't appreciate it, took it for granted. Certainly didn't show gratitude or thankfulness at all. Isn't it awful when somebody does something nice and it's not appreciated, it's not recognized? It's, instead of honoring the person that blessed you, you completely dishonor them. I mean, how would you feel as a parent if you just pour out blessing after blessing after blessing on your children, and then they completely act like you're nothing and what you say is nothing, I don't have to listen to you, I don't have to do anything you say, and they ignore you, and they act like they don't love you, don't care about you, all they want is your money and what you can do for them. Sounds a little bit like this king, doesn't it? God does and does and does and does for him. The only time he wants anything from God is when he needs something. Terrible. Number 6, he forgot what's important. How much time I got left? I got a little bit. I'm not doing too bad here. Verse 8, the second part of it. You've not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart to do that which was right in my sight. I mean, that's what was important, right? I've told you this many times. If God's happy with you, who cares what anybody else thinks? But if God's not happy with you, who cares if everybody else is happy with you? I mean, you got to make God happy. That's what was important. But instead, he went the other way. And then the last thing here, I told you I had 7 things, not just forgetting what's important, that he was supposed to obey God's commandments and do what was right. Look at verse 9. You have done more evil than all who were before you. Have gone and made for yourselves other gods and molten images to provoke me to anger, and have cast me behind your back. I mean, basically, he wasn't just blind to what was important. He wasn't just blind to all that God had done for him. He wasn't just blind to the fact that he could lose everything he had, but he was blind to God. Willfully blind. Because look what it says. You have cast me behind your back. Now that denotes the most scornful contempt of God. It's like, imagine if you had something, and you looked at it, you turn around, throw it over your shoulder, just walk away. God said, that's what it's like. That's what you did to me. You cast me behind your back. He looked at God and all that God had done for him, and he cared nothing. Tossed him over his shoulder, walked away. Now, the opposite of that would be to behold God, behold his face, to look on him, to treasure him, to become like him, because that which you worship, you're going to become like that which you behold, you're going to start to be like. And so to cast your eyes upon the Lord and not turn your back to him, but to want to be face to face with God. The 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek what? My face, then I'll heal their land. We're supposed to be a people that seek the face of God, spiritually seek, by faith, looking on him that way, through his word, by the Spirit. We seek his face. But what does this guy do? Contempt for God. And it tells you how he did it. It says, you've done more evil than all who were before you. You've gone and made for yourselves other gods and molten images to provoke me to anger. So when he turned a blind eye to God, he not only cast God away in a sense, but he sure made God angry. He provoked him to anger. And by turning away from God, obviously, what did he do? He committed a lot of evil acts. Remember what he did? When he first got on the throne and the civil war had broken out and you got two nations, he's in the north, but everybody goes to Jerusalem to worship in the south. And he said, if my people start going back down to Jerusalem and they start worshiping there the way God told them to go worship, he said, they're going to turn away from me. They're going to want to go back to the house of David. I got to do something to keep them up here and keep them out of the south. So he made golden images. Put them in two different locations. He said, these are your gods. Go worship. And he taught the people to turn astray, to go after idolatry, turn away from God. He started making people priests that were not of the right tribe and family. He just created a priesthood on his own. In other words, he created an all new religion. And when he did that, remember I told you he cast this long shadow? He's going to destroy this nation by doing that. And not only is he going to destroy this nation, but eventually what he does in the north, it affects the south. They'll turn away and do the exact same thing. They'll see what they did in the north. And in fact, they'll not just see what they did in the north, but they'll see the north get destroyed for it. And even after that, they'll go farther into idolatry and get into it worse than the north does. Ezekiel will write about it. Now, how in the world can you see them get destroyed and wiped out over what they did, and you're going to act worse than they did? Because again, what do you think is going to happen? If God's going to do it to the north, you know he's going to do it to the south. He's going to do it. So, he's provoked him to anger. Let me read to you something from Psalms chapter 9 just real quick. In the work of his own hands, the wicked is snared. The wicked will return to Sheol. You can also read that. The wicked will be turned into hell. Even all the nations who forget God. You know what nations who forget God do? Treat them with scorn, treat them with contempt, throw them behind their back, walk away. They no longer behold God. They forgot about God, what he's like. They don't know him. They don't know his word. They'll end up in hell. This man's leading his nation and then the nations around him straight to hell. So, he was blind to these truths. He's blind that he was under God just like we are under God. He's blind to the fact that he can't hide from God anything. He's blind to the fact that God is, that Israel, everything is God's, including Israel, the people he serves. He's blind to the fact that God can take what's been given. He's blind to the fact that God has done great things for him. He's forgotten all about all that God brought him from and brought him to. He's forgotten. He's blind to the fact of what's really important, obeying God, and he's blind to God himself. He's just cast a mind on his back. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, judgment's going to come. Look at verse 10. What does the prophet finally tell him? What does the blind man say to him? Therefore, behold, I'm bringing calamity on the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off from Jeroboam every male person. You got the King James Version, it might say something like, he that pisseth against the wall. Now, I'm pointing that out for a reason because, well, let me keep reading. Both bond and free in Israel. Not really sure what bond and free mean, but it could mean fettered, meaning married, and free meaning single. But the point is, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're one of the male children that comes from Jeroboam, child, grandchild, great-grandchild, you're dead. Every one of them. He says, every male person, both bond and free in Israel, I will make a clean sweep of the house of Jeroboam as one who sweeps away dung until it is all gone. Two sort of vulgar words there used in that one thing, and that's kind of a hint as to what God sees Jeroboam and his ways being like. Piss and dung. That's not by accident. Verse 11, anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs will eat. He who dies in the field, the birds of heaven will eat. The Lord has spoken it. Now, what's significant with that? Jewish people, they want to be buried. They don't want the animals chewing on their flesh and their bones, because what happens to you if an animal eats you? It's going to pass through the animal, and the only thing left of you is what they leave on the ground, right? When it's gone through their digestive system. You don't want that fate. You want to be buried. You want to have a place where your body is laid to rest. It was a very undignified is not the word. It's a dishonoring. That's what I'm trying to think. Very dishonoring thing not to be buried, and certainly to have your body on the ground and animals eat it. But total destruction is going to come. And it's so clear the blind man can see it. Of course, it helps a lot that God told him, doesn't it? But verse 12, how's it going to come? Well, he's going to talk about now, he's going to talk about later, and he's going to talk about farther off. Three ways he's going to describe it, and I'm almost done. What's going to come real soon? Verse 12, now you arise, go to your house, and when your feet enter the city, the child's going to die. So one that she came to ask about, that boy that's sick, he's not going to make it. He's not going to recover. Instead, it's going to go the other way. All Israel shall mourn for him and bury him, for he alone of Jeroboam's family will come to the grave, because in him something good was found toward the Lord God of Israel in the house of Jeroboam. Isn't that amazing? I'm trying to think how I want to attack this, because I got 2 or 3 ways I want to go with it. How can I put it all together real quick? It's amazing that Jeroboam, as wicked as he is, he's got this son. We don't know how old he is. He's younger. But he's obviously the firstborn, and he's the heir. But as wicked as Jeroboam is, God says, found something good in him. Meaning what? God's not necessarily condemning this child. This child is right with God. He's not like Jeroboam. He goes the other way. You can have a wicked daddy. Still have a boy that's a good boy, that knows God and wants to honor God and loves God. So something good was found in him, God said. And so when God pronounced judgment against the children of Jeroboam, and by the way, is that right for God to do? Can God do that? Well, everything God does is right. If Jeroboam is going to take the children of God, the family of Israel, and wreck and destroy them spiritually, is it right for God to give the same thing to Jeroboam's family? There it is. God's judgment is absolutely perfect. Jeroboam's going to turn and kill, spiritually speaking, an entire nation of God's people. God says, I'm taking your family out. Going that way. And that's not, don't hear that as a kind of sinful human way of doing it. God's doing this because it's right. But when he sees this child, he says there's something good in him. So all the other children are going to die how? In some kind of a horrible way that's going to leave their bodies on the ground. The animals are going to come get them. But God says, this boy is a good boy, and I'm going to let him die and be honored in his death as the firstborn heir of the king, and the entire nation is going to mourn for him. Everybody else is going to be chewed up by animals. This boy is not. Interesting, huh? Moreover, verse 14, so that's coming close. Verse 14, something's a little bit later off. Moreover, the Lord's going to raise up for himself a king over Israel who will cut off the house of Jeroboam this day and from now on. You're going to see that in chapter 15. But judgment day is coming. And then further off from that, God says, for the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. He'll uproot Israel for this good land which he gave to their fathers. He will scatter them beyond the Euphrates River because they have made the Asherim, provoking the Lord to anger. Now this is going to be about 200 years in coming. But it's going to be real soon that God raises up another king that's going to wipe out all the heirs of Jeroboam and take out the competition. But eventually God's going to send a group in called the Assyrians. Assyrians are going to come from their capital cities, Nineveh. They're going to come from kind of the northern area over where Iran is. And they're going to sweep down and sweep in. They're going to take over that area, and they're going to take all these people captive and bring them back, and they're going to move some of their people in. Well, not all the people out. They're going to interbreed with them, and because they interbreed, they become kind of a half-breed, and they eventually become the people known as the Samaritans. But God's going to bring all of them in that land to destruction. And he's going to uproot them, defeat them, and scatter them. By the way, when you hear that, what is that? That's what's called covenant language. When Moses came out with the people of Israel, and they wandered through the desert, and God gave them the covenant, and God entered a covenant relationship with them. A covenant is a contract, like it's an agreement. God says, if you do this, then I will do that. And if you do this, I'm going to bless you. If you do this, I'm going to curse you. And so when you see God doing these things, God's being faithful to what he said he was going to do. Let me just read to you real quickly out of Deuteronomy 28, some of what it said. The Lord shall cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You will go out one way against them, but you will flee 7 ways before them. You will be an example of terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Your carcasses will be food to all the birds of the sky. Again, animals eating your flesh, not being buried. And to the beasts of the earth, and there will be no one to frighten them away. Here's another section. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the ends of the earth, as the eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you shall not understand. What's significant about not understanding a language when you're invaded? When you beg for help and cry for mercy, they don't know what you're saying. A nation of fierce countenance who will have no respect for the old or show favor to the young. Moreover, it shall eat the offspring of your herd and the produce of your ground until you are destroyed, who leaves you no grain, no wine, no oil, no increase of your herd and the young of your flock until they've caused you to perish. It shall besiege you in all your towns and your high and fortified walls. Let me read one more section to you, because all this is covenant. It's the agreement they made with God. It shall come about that as the Lord delighted over you to prosper you, to multiply you, so the Lord will delight over you to make you perish and destroy you, and will be torn from the land where you are entering to possess it. Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. There you'll serve other gods, wood and stone, which you or your fathers have not known. Among these nations you shall find no rest, no resting place for the sole of your foot. The Lord will give it a trembling heart, failing eyes, and despair of soul, so your life will hang in doubt before you. You'll be in dread night and day. You shall have no assurance of your life. That's what happens when you get taken to a foreign country and enslaved. But God's faithful. He's just as faithful to curse as he is to bless. They didn't keep their end of the bargain, and God said, if you turn away from me and you follow other gods, this is exactly what I'm going to do to you. And God did exactly what he said he was going to do. It's not like they didn't know. He told them what was coming, and they did it anyway. That's about 200 years coming. When you see this, and you hear this, it's a reminder once again of how seriously God takes sin. When you see Jesus on the cross, and he's beaten and battered to a pulp, and he's suffering and dying, it's an example of how seriously God takes sin. It's more than that. We don't ever need to forget, because we act sometimes like it's no big deal. Friends, ask the people that lived in Noah's day if it was a big deal. Sin, something God takes very seriously. And when nations, even in our day, read this and see that when nations turn against God, it can bring a disaster. We're not taking seriously the God of this Bible. And when individuals turn away from God and they enter into sin, we're not seeing how seriously. We're blind, just like this king was. You read verse 16, it tells you exactly the reason God did the whole thing. He will give up Israel on account of the sins of Jeroboam. One man. The whole nation is destroyed, and it started with one man. He'll give up Israel on account of the sins of Jeroboam, which he committed, and with which he made Israel to sin. Let me tell you something. One man's sin, it doesn't just affect that one man. It can affect your family. It can affect your community. It can affect your church. It can affect a nation. Be careful. This is a disaster, and the whole thing could have been avoided if Jeroboam wouldn't have been blind to all these things. Instead, he would have seen with spiritual eyes and walked with God. Let me read the end of this text, and we'll be done. Jeroboam's wife arose and departed and came to Tirzah. As she was entering the threshold of the house, the child died. All Israel buried him and mourned for him, according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoke through his servant Ahijah the prophet. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he made war and how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. The time of Jeroboam's reign was 22 years. He slept with his fathers, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. Let's pray. Father, tonight we've been reminded of some truths that we need to take seriously and be reminded of, because when disaster comes, we don't want to be like Jeroboam, only seeking you at that time. But we want to be like those that the preacher spoke about Sunday morning, when he reminded us, kiss the Son, worship the King. Jesus, you are our King. We don't want to just look to you in the bad times. We want to look to you all the time. We want to honor you day and night with our lives, our souls, our all. Lord, everything is yours, and your eyes see it all. Everything you've given is grace. And Lord, if you take it away, you're only taking back what's yours. You have the power of life and death. You make nations rich, and you make nations poor. You make success come, and you make failure come. You are sovereign. You are good. You are right. You are just. Lord, thank you for showing us in this text, reminding us about these things, about you and your judgment. And Lord, we pray we'd be a people of God that honors you, turns toward your face, never casting you behind our back. Lord, may we seek you always and praise you no matter what comes. We love you, Jesus. Amen. Have a good night, everyone. God bless you.